We must not turn away from the truth that binds us all. It is through understanding and unity that we will prevail.
Have you ever watched a Harvard professor question everything he believed about intelligence in the space of a single conversation? Cambridge, Massachusetts, spring 1948. One of America's most prestigious universities was about to witness an encounter that would force their most distinguished music scholar to confront the difference between education and wisdom. And what happened in that lecture hall would haunt Dr. Theodore Whitfield for the rest of his academic career. If you love discovering the untold stories behind music history's most incredible moments, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell because we uncover the hidden gems that shape the legends we know today. Harvard University, Memorial Hall, April 22, 1948. 2:15 p.m. Dr. Theodore Whitfield stood at the podium of Lecture Hall B, preparing for what he assumed would be a routine guest presentation. Harvard's music department had invited several contemporary musicians to speak about American musical forms, and today's speaker was a jazz singer named Billie Holiday. Dr. Whitfield wasn't particularly enthusiastic about the arrangement. At 52, he was Harvard's most published musicologist, author of definitive texts on European classical composition. He'd spent 30 years studying music theory, harmonic structure, and the mathematical principles underlying great composition. Jazz, in his professional opinion, was a primitive form of musical expression. Interesting from an anthropological perspective, perhaps, but hardly worthy of serious academic consideration. Theodore had grown up in Boston's Beacon Hill, attended Phillips Academy, graduated summa cum laude from Harvard in 1918, and completed his PhD in musicology at Cambridge University. He spoke 4 languages, had studied with the great European composers, and his office walls were lined with awards from the most prestigious academic institutions in the world. When the department head had suggested inviting jazz musicians to speak, Theodore had been politely skeptical. "Are we certain these performers can engage meaningfully with our students?" he'd asked. Academic discourse requires a certain level of intellectual sophistication, but the university was making efforts to broaden its cultural perspectives, and Theodore was expected to participate collegially. As students filtered into the lecture hall, Theodore reviewed his notes. He'd prepared several thoughtful questions about jazz's historical development, its relationship to African musical traditions, and its place in the broader context of American folk music. He intended to guide the discussion towards serious musical analysis. At 2:30, Billie Holiday entered the lecture hall. Theodore had seen photographs of jazz performers before, but meeting Billie in person was different. She carried herself with quiet dignity, wore an elegant dress that spoke of careful attention to detail, and moved with the kind of composed confidence Theodore associated with his most accomplished colleagues. "Dr. Whitfield," Billie said, extending her hand, "thank you for inviting me to speak with your students." Theodore shook her hand, noting the firmness of her grip and the directness of her gaze. "Miss Holiday, we're honored to have you here. I hope you'll find our students appropriately receptive to your perspective." There was something in his tone, a subtle condescension that Billie recognized immediately. She'd heard it before from educated men who assumed her lack of formal training meant a lack of intelligence. "I'm sure they will," Billie replied simply. Theodore addressed the class. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we have Miss Billie Holiday, a prominent performer in the jazz idiom. Miss Holiday will share her experiences in popular music, and we'll explore how her work relates to our ongoing study of American musical development." He turned to Billie. "Perhaps you could begin by telling us about your musical background, your training, your influences, how you developed your approach to performance." Billie looked out at the classroom. 43 students, mostly white, mostly from privileged backgrounds, all watching her with polite curiosity. "I don't have much formal training," Billie said honestly. "I learned to sing by listening, by feeling, by living through the things I sing about." Theodore nodded patronizingly. "Yes, the oral tradition is quite important in folk music. Of course, without theoretical foundation, it can be difficult to achieve true artistic sophistication. Tell me, Miss Holiday, are you familiar with harmonic analysis? Do you understand the mathematical relationships that govern chord progressions?" The question was designed to demonstrate the gulf between trained musicianship and intuitive performance. Theodore wasn't trying to be cruel, but he believed in the superiority of formal education. Billie was quiet for a moment. Dr. Whitfield, what do you think music is for? The question caught Theodore off guard. I'm sorry. Music. What's its purpose? Theodore straightened his tie. Well, music serves multiple functions. Aesthetic appreciation, cultural expression, mathematical exploration of harmonic relationships. Do you think music should make people feel something? Certainly emotion can be a component of musical experience. But the greatest music transcends mere emotional response. It engages the intellect, challenges our understanding of compositional structure. Have you ever heard someone sing about something that changed how you understood your own life? Theodore looked uncomfortable. This wasn't the kind of academic discussion he'd prepared for. Miss Holiday, while personal response to music is valid, we're here to discuss music from an analytical perspective. Our students need to understand the technical foundations of musical composition. Billie nodded slowly. Dr. Whitfield, can I ask you something? Of course. What's the saddest thing that's ever happened to you? The lecture hall went dead silent. Students looked back and forth between their professor and the jazz singer. Theodore felt exposed, cornered. I don't see how my personal experiences are relevant to our discussion of musical theory. Just curious. You want to talk about how music works, right? I'm wondering if you've ever had music help you work through something difficult. Theodore cleared his throat. Miss Holiday, we're here to discuss your professional experiences, not to engage in personal therapy. I'm not trying to therapy you, Dr. Whitfield. I'm trying to understand how you think about music. I think about music as an art form worthy of serious intellectual consideration. And I sing about music as a way to survive things that might kill you, if you don't have some way to get them out of your body. The statement hung in the air. Theodore felt like the conversation was slipping away from him, becoming something he couldn't control. Miss Holiday, while I appreciate the authenticity of your approach, surely you understand that art requires more than raw emotion. It requires discipline, training, understanding of form and structure. Dr. Whitfield, can you sing? I beg your pardon? Can you sing? Do you ever sing? Theodore looked flustered. I'm a musicologist, not a performer. But you study music for a living. You must sing sometimes. I analyze music. I don't perform it. So you study music but you don't make music. I study the principles underlying great musical composition. But you don't compose. Theodore was becoming frustrated. Miss Holiday, there's a difference between scholarship and performance. Both are valuable, but they require different skill sets. What skill do you think I have? The question was simple, but Theodore realized it was also a trap. Whatever he said would reveal his assumptions about her abilities. You have natural talent, intuitive musicality, the ability to connect with audiences. And what skill do you have? I have extensive training in musical theory, historical analysis, compositional structure. Do you think those skills make you a better musician than me? Theodore paused. The honest answer was yes. He did believe his formal training made him more qualified to discuss music. But saying so would sound arrogant. I think we have different types of musical knowledge, he said carefully. Dr. Whitfield, I want to try something. I'm going to sing a song and then I want you to analyze it for your students. Tell them what makes it work musically. Theodore felt more comfortable with this proposition. That would be quite helpful for our study. Billie stood up and moved away from the podium, positioning herself in the center of the lecture hall. Without any accompaniment, she began to sing Strange Fruit. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. The effect was immediate and devastating. Theodore had heard recordings of jazz music before, but he'd never experienced anything like this. Billie's voice filled the lecture hall with raw emotion that seemed to bypass rational thought entirely. The students sat frozen. Several were crying. The song wasn't just about lynching. It was about witnessing evil, about carrying the weight of injustice, about the cost of remaining human in an inhumane world. When Billie finished, the silence stretched for nearly a minute. Dr. Whitfield, Billie said quietly, can you analyze that for your students? Theodore stared at her. How could he talk about chord progressions after what they just experienced? How could he discuss harmonic structure when everyone in the room was still processing the emotional trauma of the song? The melodic structure is quite simple, Theodore began weakly. Basic minor tonality, conventional phrasing. Is that what you heard? Billie asked. I heard a powerful performance. But from a technical standpoint. Dr. Whitfield, what did you learn from that song? Learn. About history. About America. About what it means to be human. Theodore struggled. Music can certainly illuminate social conditions. The song is obviously a protest against racial violence. It's not a protest, Billie said gently. It's a witness testimony. What's the difference? A protest is trying to change something. A witness testimony is just telling the truth about what you've seen. Whether anyone does anything about it is up to them. Theodore felt something shift inside his chest. The academic distinction between protest and testimony had never occurred to him. Dr. Whitfield, when you analyze music, what are you looking for? I'm looking for the principles that make it effective. The structural elements that create artistic value. And when I sing that song, what am I looking for? Theodore thought about this. You're trying to communicate something. I'm trying to make sure no one ever forgets what happened to those people. The weight of this statement settled over the lecture hall. Theodore realized that Billie wasn't performing music. She was preserving human memory. One of the students raised her hand. Miss Holiday, how do you choose which songs to sing? Billie looked at the young woman. I sing the songs that need to be sung. The ones that tell truths people don't want to hear. But how do you know what needs to be sung? Another student asked. The same way you know when you're hungry or tired. You pay attention to what's missing. Theodore found himself asking a question he hadn't planned. Miss Holiday, when you perform that song, what's happening inside your mind? Billie looked at him with surprise. It was the first question he'd asked that seemed to come from genuine curiosity rather than academic superiority. I'm remembering, Billie said. I'm remembering every story I've heard about those people. Every photograph I've seen. Every time someone tried to tell me it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. And performing helps you remember? Performing helps everyone else remember. Theodore was quiet for a long moment. Miss Holiday, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest. Okay. Do you think formal musical training would improve your performances? Billie considered the question carefully. Dr. Whitfield, if I studied music theory, learned to read notation, understood harmonic analysis, do you think I'd sing that song differently? You might sing it more correctly. What would make it more correct? Theodore realized he was trapped again. By any technical measure, Billie's performance had been flawless. Her pitch was perfect, her timing impeccable, her phrasing masterful. I suppose it wouldn't necessarily improve the technical aspects, Theodore admitted. But you think it would improve something. It would give you a broader understanding of musical possibilities. Dr. Whitfield, what if I told you that song taught me more about music than any textbook ever could? How so? Because it taught me that the most important thing about music isn't how complex you can make it. It's how honest you can be while you're making it. Theodore felt his worldview beginning to crack. But surely complexity has value. Sophistication, innovation, pushing the boundaries of what music can achieve. Dr. Whitfield, can I ask you something else? Yes. When was the last time music made you cry? The question hit Theodore like a physical blow. He tried to think back through decades of concert attendance, album listening, scholarly analysis. He could remember being impressed, being intellectually stimulated, being professionally interested. But when had music last moved him to tears? It's not something I typically track. Can you remember the last time you heard a piece of music that changed how you felt about something important? Theodore was struggling now. Miss Holiday, I think we may be conflating emotional response with artistic merit. Are we? Or are we talking about why music exists in the first place? Music exists for many reasons. What's the most important reason? Theodore felt like he was being deconstructed by someone he'd assumed was intellectually inferior to him. I suppose to create beauty. Beauty for who? For anyone capable of appreciating it. Dr. Whitfield, when you heard me sing that song, did you think it was beautiful? The question was impossible to answer simply. The song had been devastating, powerful, transformative. But beautiful? It was complex, emotionally challenging, artistically significant. But was it beautiful? Theodore struggled with this. I think it was truthful. And is truth beautiful? Sometimes. When? When it helps us understand something important. Billie nodded. Dr. Whitfield, what did my song help you understand? Theodore was quiet for a long time. The students waited. The question wasn't academic anymore. It was personal. It helped me understand that I've been studying music without understanding what music is for. Theodore said finally. What do you think music is for? I think it's for connection. For making us feel less alone with the things we can't say any other way. Dr. Whitfield, do you think someone needs formal training to create that kind of connection? Theodore felt 30 years of assumptions collapsing. No, I don't think they do. Do you think formal training can sometimes get in the way of that connection? This was the question Theodore had been afraid of. Yes, I think it can. Does that mean formal training is bad? No, it means formal training is a tool. And like any tool, it's only as good as the purpose you're using it for. What do you think you've been using your formal training for? Theodore looked around the lecture hall. His students were watching him have his entire academic philosophy dismantled by a jazz singer with no college education. I think I've been using it to prove how smart I am, Theodore said quietly. And what would you rather use it for? I'd rather use it to understand why music matters. Billie smiled for the first time since entering the lecture hall. Dr. Whitfield, I think you just became educated. The class erupted in applause. Not polite academic applause, but the kind of emotional response usually reserved for transformative moments. Theodore stood at the podium, feeling like everything he thought he knew about his profession had just been revealed as incomplete. After the students left, Theodore and Billie sat alone in the lecture hall. Miss Holiday, I owe you an apology. For what? For assuming that formal education was the only path to real understanding. Dr. Whitfield, formal education is valuable. But education and wisdom aren't the same thing. What's the difference? Education is learning facts. Wisdom is learning what to do with them. Theodore nodded. And you think I've confused the two? I think a lot of people do. The academy rewards people for knowing things, not for understanding what those things mean. What do you think I should do with this realization? Billie considered this. Dr. Whitfield, what would happen if you taught your students to ask different questions? What kind of questions? Instead of how does this music work? What if you asked, why does this music exist? Instead of what makes this technically proficient? What if you asked what makes this necessary? Theodore felt something shift in his understanding of his profession. That would change everything. Would that be bad? No. It would be revolutionary. Dr. Whitfield, education should be revolutionary. If it's not changing how people see the world, what's the point? 6 months later, Theodore Whitfield submitted his resignation from Harvard University. His letter to the department head read, After 30 years of studying music, I have realized that I don't know the first thing about what music actually is. I need to learn to listen before I can teach anyone else to hear. Theodore spent the next year traveling to jazz clubs, blues venues, and folk music gatherings. He didn't go as a scholar analyzing musical forms. He went as a student trying to understand what music meant to the people who created it and the people who needed it. When he returned to academia, it was as a professor at a small liberal arts college where he could experiment with new approaches to musical education. Instead of starting with theory, he started with listening. Instead of analyzing structure, he explored purpose. Instead of teaching students what made music technically correct, he helped them discover what made music emotionally necessary. Theodore's new approach was controversial. Traditional musicologists criticized his methods as unscholarly and anti-intellectual. But his students began producing work that combined rigorous analysis with deep emotional understanding. In 1952, Theodore published a paper titled, The Difference Between Studying Music and Understanding Music. It challenged the fundamental assumptions of academic musicology and suggested that true musical scholarship required both intellectual rigor and emotional engagement. The paper was rejected by every major musicological journal, but it was widely circulated among music educators who felt constrained by traditional academic approaches. Theodore never saw Billie Holiday perform again, but he kept her words with him for the rest of his career. When students asked him what made a great musician, he would say, "Technical skill can make you impressive, but truth makes you necessary." Theodore's transformation didn't happen overnight. In the months following his encounter with Billie, he struggled with feelings of intellectual fraud. Had his entire career been built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what music was supposed to accomplish? He began attending jazz performances in Boston, sitting in the back of small clubs, listening not as a scholar but as someone trying to understand what he'd been missing. At first, the experience was disorienting. Without his analytical framework, he felt lost, unsure how to process what he was hearing. But gradually, Theodore began to experience music differently. He stopped trying to identify chord progressions and started paying attention to how the music made him feel. He stopped analyzing lyrical structure and started listening to what the songs were actually saying. Theodore's colleagues at Harvard noticed the change in his teaching. His lectures became less technical, more exploratory. Instead of presenting definitive analyses of musical works, he began asking students to discuss their emotional responses to the music. But Theodore's students were responding differently. Class attendance increased. Students stayed after lectures to continue discussions. Papers became more personal, more passionate, more honest. One student, Patricia Chun, wrote in her final paper, "Dr. Whitfield taught me that understanding music isn't about being smart enough to decode it. It's about being brave enough to let it change you." In interviews later in life, Theodore would always credit his encounter with Billie Holiday as the moment he learned the difference between being educated and being wise. "She taught me that the most important questions about music can't be answered through analysis," Theodore would say. "They can only be answered through living." Theodore's resignation from Harvard sent shockwaves through the academic music community. Here was one of their most respected scholars, walking away from the pinnacle of academic success. "I don't understand it," his former department head told colleagues. Theodore had everything: tenure, publications, respect. Why throw it all away for some philosophical crisis? But Theodore wasn't throwing anything away. He was finally beginning to understand what he'd been missing. At his new position at the Liberal Arts College, Theodore instituted what he called music and meaning seminars. Instead of studying pieces chronologically or by composer, students explored music thematically. Songs of protest, songs of love, songs of loss, songs of hope. The approach was revolutionary. Students weren't just learning about music. They were discovering how music could help them understand their own lives and the world around them. One of Theodore's first assignments was deceptively simple. Find a song that changed how you think about something important. Write about why it affected you and how it connects to larger human experiences. The papers that resulted were unlike anything Theodore had seen in traditional musicology courses. Students wrote about finding comfort in gospel music after losing a parent, about understanding historical injustice through blues recordings, about discovering their own identity through folk songs. "Dr. Whitfield's class saved my life," one student wrote in a course evaluation. "I was so focused on being academically successful that I'd forgotten why I loved music in the first place. He reminded me that music isn't just something to study. It's something to live with." Theodore Whitfield died in 1967. At his memorial service, former students from both Harvard and the Liberal Arts College spoke about his impact on their understanding of music and life. Patricia Chun, now a professor herself, delivered the main eulogy. "Theodore Whitfield taught us that intelligence isn't about how much you know. It's about how willing you are to discover that everything you thought you knew was only the beginning. He showed us that the highest form of scholarship is humility, and the greatest music education is learning to listen not just with your mind, but with your heart." But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from a letter found among his papers, written by a student who had been present in Memorial Hall that day in 1948. "Dear Professor Whitfield, I've been thinking about that afternoon when Billie Holiday came to speak to our class. I remember watching your face during her performance, seeing everything you thought you knew about music get turned upside down. That day you didn't just teach us about music. You taught us about intellectual courage. You showed us that being wrong about something important is the first step toward being right about something that matters. Thank you for having the strength to learn in front of us. The story of Theodore Whitfield and Billie Holiday never became famous. There are no recordings of their conversation. No newspaper accounts of the day. A Harvard professor learned humility from a jazz singer. But the ripple effects of that encounter continued for decades. Students who witnessed the exchange went on to become teachers, musicians, and scholars who brought a different kind of intellectual humility to their work. They understood that true education isn't about accumulating knowledge. It's about developing the wisdom to know when knowledge isn't enough. In 1985, Harvard's music department established the Theodore Whitfield Memorial Lecture Series, featuring speakers who bridged the gap between academic study and lived musical experience. The inaugural lecture was delivered by a jazz historian who began her talk with these words. Theodore Whitfield understood something that took me years to learn. That the most profound musical education happens not when we master music, but when we allow music to master us.